Hi, this is Mike Yant, and today is January 23rd. No, it's July 23rd, 2016. And this is the weekly video teaching that I do. And as you know, or if you've been listening or watching, you know that the last few weeks I've been talking and giving some background about each of the books I've written. I have 5 books published now. And by published, I mean um, digitally published. I don't have any print. There's no place you can go and get print copies. They're all, on tablets like this. So iPad or Kindle or whatever device. I mean, you actually read it on an iPhone. Uh, so I guess you could read it on any phone. But at any rate, today I get to the 5th one, the last one, um, the New Testament from a Distance. And I wanted to give some background on that. I thought you might appreciate that. And I would if I were a reader. Of the 5 books, 3 of them, just as a reminder, 3 of them I wrote 20, 25 years ago. And then 2 of them are very recent. The one I've already talked about, Finding Faith, the Historical Jesus and the Undisputed Paulines, which I recognize is a little bit of an unusual title for maybe the type of writing I do. But I think I explained that in the video when I talked about that. And then today, the New Testament from a Distance. And these 2 books actually work in parallel. The Finding Faith, the Historical Jesus, and the Undisputed Paulines is like a real up-close view of the New Testament. In fact, it looks specifically at 7 letters from the Apostle Paul. It doesn't look at any of the other 20 books in the New Testament, just at those 7 letters. And from those 7 letters, pulls out information that the apostles taught about their personal experiences with Jesus, both before and after he was resurrected from the dead. And in so doing, it establishes a basis for faith. In other words, it tells us what the apostles' testimony is regarding Jesus of Nazareth, so that we can either accept or reject what they say. I find that almost everyone who's rejected what they said has either not spent much time reading it, or there's some other explanation for why they get out of it, because the testimony is just overwhelming, and you just have to willfully not want to believe in order not to believe, because it's just too plausible, it's too compelling. I'm not going to try to go into all that right now. But that's that book. This book pulls back and looks at the New Testament from a distance. And there's actually 2 or 3 dimensions of meaning in that I was thinking of when I gave it that title. The New Testament from a distance means to pull back and not to look at the individual books or the individual verses. In fact, I don't quote a Bible verse anywhere in the book. And to sort of emphasize that point, I didn't put the copyright notice for the New American Standard Bible in there, which I normally do in everything I write, because that's the primary Bible that I use to study. So it's looking at the New Testament from a distance as a literary collection, as an ancient literary collection. And it also means from a distance because I wrote it so that an unbeliever could read it. I put myself back in my shoes when I was in my mid to late 20s and began reading the New Testament for the first time. And wrote it to sort of help me. Not that I needed it then so much. I think it would have sped up the conclusion that I came to. I would have come to it faster. But some people might need the help to say, hey, if you want to read the Bible as it was originally written, or read the New Testament, you need to understand what it is without all the religious or ecclesiastical baggage. So let me read to you from the description I wrote for it. Although addressed to unbelievers as an invitation to approach the New Testament as reliable ancient literature rather than as a church textbook. Okay, so I did write it for unbelievers as an invitation to them to approach the New Testament as reliable ancient literature and not as a church textbook. In other words, how would you like to read this collection of ancient writings without having to make a commitment, a religious commitment of any kind first? And how would you like to read it? How would you like some help approaching it to read without having to hear a lot of religious demands placed on you? So I don't have any of that in there. In the last chapter, I do come to a conclusion and I say, okay, now that you're ready to read it, when you read it, this is what I urge you to think about. And I make clear that I have a very strong religious commitment to Jesus, to the New Testament. But I remember how I approached it originally, and therefore I can understand how somebody else could approach it. Okay, so let me read the first part of that sentence again and then continue it on. Although addressed to unbelievers as an invitation to approach the New Testament as reliable ancient literature rather than as a church textbook, this book will also help believers who struggle with doubts, whether from within or without, about the reliability of the text or the authors of the New Testament. So that might seem a little bit strange. How could you address both audiences at the same time, because they're so different? One, you got these unbelievers who are like, I don't know if I even believe anything in the New Testament. I just want to know how to read it, just like ancient writing. And then you got this other group over here who they're committed Christians, but they're like, are all of 14 of Paul's letters really by Paul, or are some of these skeptical Bible scholars right when they say some of them are not from Paul? Who do I believe? So it's not immediately, it's not intuitive that the same book would address both groups, but it really will. And I can't explain to you why that's the case, but if you read the book, I think you'll see it. The book lays out the case that the only reasonable way to read the New Testament by anyone, believer or unbeliever, is by accepting that its 27 individual texts are what was originally written and that their authors are the ones claimed in the respective titles, including Hebrews. A lot of people will say that, well, Paul didn't really write Hebrews, but when the ancient believers put together the Bible, the reason that Hebrews got included was because they thought it was Paul's. So I've got discussion about that in there. So it's approximately 50,000 words. So it's not a real little book at all. I think the average nonfiction book, at least I looked this up like years ago when I originally wrote my 3 books, is about 75,000 words. I would have to believe that average size has gone down over the years, especially with the advent of digital books, because there's just a lot of digital books that are a lot shorter. A really, really long essay is probably about 10,000 words. Some essays might be a little longer than that, but I don't think so. But anyway, that just gives you an idea of where 50,000 words might come in. I mean, it's a book. Not a big book, but it's a book. And so I go through how the New Testament came to be. And it's a very, to me, it's just a fascinating process. And it's not, I think the Da Vinci Code, I've never read it, but from what I've heard, there's something in there about, the books of the Bible were chosen by some ecclesiastical council, and, the bishops decided, there was an argument, and they decided which, but it's not like that at all. It's not like that at all. It has... Let's see how many chapters it has. It has 21 chapters. So I'm not going to cover every chapter, but I just want to read through them. Got the introduction. What is the New Testament? I talk about, okay, everybody knows what the New Testament is. Anybody can find a New Testament, even people that don't believe it. You can go to the library, the bookstore, hotel room. I talk about it's chapter 3 is ancient literature. It's accessible, but it's accessible to modern people. Then I talk about the difference between ancient writings and modern writings. And probably the biggest difference between ancient writings and modern writings is that modern writings are all done from a printing press, so they're all the copies look identical. But prior to the printing press, which is invented in the 15th century, all copies were made by hand, and because they're made by hand, there can be errors. So you have to have a way of it doesn't mean you can't trust the copies, but it just means you have to have a way of resolving differences that might be in the copies from the original. And I talk about that, and that's I'm speaking about all ancient literature, not just the Bible, but Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Thucydides, Herodotus, all those classical Greek and Roman authors. It's the same issue. And there's this field of text called textual criticism, where textual critics, with help from paleographers who study handwriting, figure out what the original said. So I talk about that. Then I talk about the stages in the history of the New Testament text, that what you have in the first century is the apostles writing these different 27 letters. They weren't all in one place. They were scattered all over the Mediterranean world, and they sent them to different places. Paul's letter to the Ephesians goes to Ephesus. His letter to Romans goes to Rome. So you got these 27 documents are written all over the place. They're sent all over the place. And yet, how did we end up with all 27 in the New Testament some 300 years later? Well, that's what I go through here and explain. And I talk about why it took so long, how it happened, and in the end, what it demonstrates is that the authors of these various texts are known by the same way we know that Plato wrote the stuff that's attributed to him, and Aristotle wrote the stuff that's attributed to him, and Herodotus wrote the stuff attributed to him, and so on. You know that by virtue of the fact that when somebody writes something, people around them, contemporaries, become aware of it because they get a copy of it, or they see him with his original, or whatever it is. They know it, and then from generation to generation, it's just passed on that, yeah, so-and-so wrote that. Yeah, you can trust that this manuscript is really from him. So anyway, it's treating the New Testament like what it is, which is ancient literature, instead of treating it differently because it's religious in nature. There's a lot of skeptical books out these days. There's a University of North Carolina professor named Bart Ehrman who's sold a ton of books, bestseller status, with stuff like, he's got a book called Forged and Jesus Misquoted. And he's a former evangelical who lost his faith or abandoned his faith, and is now calls himself an agnostic-leaning atheist. You can get splinters from sitting on a fence like that. But anyway, he writes really just, I don't know what to say. It's just like he's just always throwing mud against the wall to see what'll stick. He comes across as very authoritative, and he's a very smart guy. He's extremely intelligent, extremely well educated. I think he got his PhD at Princeton. Got his bachelor's at Moody Bible Institute, I think. But he basically mocks Christianity, and he equivocates about a lot of things, which he tries to have it both ways. And in large part, I'm writing to combat his influence, because an unsuspecting person who's thinking about reading the New Testament and then reads one of these books by Bart Ehrman will think, I can read the New Testament, but that doesn't mean that's what's originally written, or I can't know who wrote what, and it says it's by Paul, but I can't trust that, and I can read it, but if I believed Bart Ehrman, I would not waste a moment reading the New Testament. I would not waste a moment of time if I believed him, because what he's saying is, you can't be sure of what it says, you can't be sure of who wrote it. And even if you could, he also says this, even if you could be sure what it says, you can't be sure that that's what really happened. So why would anybody read it? Why does he study it? Why does he make a living off of it if it's that unreliable? But man, he can sound persuasive to somebody who doesn't know any better. And so that's what I'm trying. It's one of the things I'm trying to address. Most of all, I want to help. I want to do two things. I want to, if you know someone who has never read the New Testament, maybe give them this. Now, this might be a bit much. I mean, you'll have to read it yourself before you do that. Now that I think about it, it just depends on the person, because I sort of can see a person who's never been exposed to the New Testament. They read this and they might just be kind of overwhelmed by it. But you decide for yourself. My hope was certainly that I could write it in such a way that someone who didn't know the New Testament could approach it in a knowledgeable way. But sometimes when you try to explain things, you realize, okay, I got to go into more detail to explain this. And after a while, you've gone into a lot of detail and you wonder whether that's going to help everybody or not. So I hope it helps those people. And just as much, if not more, I wrote it so that when any believer is reading the New Testament and it says the letter of Paul to Timothy, that they can have confidence that it is Paul's letter to Timothy, that Paul's the one who wrote it, Timothy's the one that received it, and that you can trust all the titles that are in there, even when they're not originally written by Paul. Obviously, Paul's not going to write a letter to Timothy and put a title at the top and say, Paul's letter to Timothy. The gospel writers did not put their own titles. Matthew didn't put the gospel according to Matthew, and Mark put the gospel according to Mark. Those came later. But you can have confidence when you read. And all this skepticism, all this information that's in these study Bibles and commentaries about these scholars who argue about who wrote this and who didn't. I mean, what a waste of time. It's like arguing about the number of angels you can fit on a pin. It reminds me so much of reading the Gospels about the discussions and the arguments that the Pharisees had and the Sadducees, and Jesus would tell them, look, you strain at gnats and swallow camels. So these are the two groups for which I wrote the book. Presumably you fall into one or the other. And I hope it helps you, and I hope the background on the book has helped you as well. The New Testament from a distance. And I hope if you read it that you won't want to keep it at a distance anymore. God bless you.